The Pope's own son murdered his brother and dumped the body in the Tiber River like yesterday's garbage. Welcome to Dark Dynasties, where we dig up the dirt on history's most twisted families. Today's story? The Borgias, a Spanish crime syndicate that didn't just infiltrate the Catholic Church. They became it. Think the Mafia invented organized crime? Think again. The Borgias were running Murder Incorporated centuries before Capone was even a twinkle in his father's eye. And they did it all while wearing funny hats and blessing people. So how exactly does a family of minor Spanish nobles end up turning the Vatican into their personal playground of poison, incest, and political assassination? Well, it starts with good old-fashioned nepotism and ends with, well, let's just say karma's got quite the sense of humor. Let's start at the beginning, shall we? Because every crime family needs an origin story. The year is 1455. Alfonso de Borgia, that's Borgia in Spanish, manages to sweet-talk his way onto the papal throne as Pope Calixtus III. His first executive decision as God's representative on earth? Immediately make his nephew Rodrigo a cardinal. Not because Rodrigo had any particular spiritual calling, mind you. The guy was 25, and his main qualification was sharing DNA with the Pope. But hey, when you're running a medieval monarchy disguised as a religion, family comes first. This single act of nepotism created the template that would define the Borgia playbook for decades. Use church power to advance family interests. Period. Full stop. Amen. Fast forward 37 years. Cardinal Rodrigo Borgia has spent nearly 4 decades perfecting what we might call ecclesiastical entrepreneurship. Translation: he's been selling church positions like they're baseball cards, accumulating enough wealth to make a Renaissance banker weep with envy, and oh yeah, fathering multiple children while supposedly being celibate. But here's where it gets interesting. Pope Innocent VIII kicks the bucket in 1492, and suddenly there's a job opening for the most powerful position in Christendom. Now, papal elections weren't supposed to work like eBay auctions, but nobody told Rodrigo that. What happened next was essentially the medieval equivalent of a hostile corporate takeover, except instead of stock options, we're talking about human souls. Cardinal Ascanio Sforza, 4 mule loads of silver, that's roughly $5 million in today's money. Cardinal Orsini got the vice-chancellorship and Rodrigo's Roman palace, basically a medieval signing bonus. Cardinal Colonna received the wealthy abbey of Subiaco, because nothing says spiritual calling like a lucrative real estate deal. The bidding was so blatant, so shameless, that even by medieval standards, and these were people who thought bathing was suspicious, people were shocked. But here's the thing about corruption. It works. Rodrigo Borgia became Pope Alexander VI, proving that in 1492 absolutely everything was for sale, including salvation itself. And that's when things got really interesting. Most corrupt officials slip their relatives a cushy government job or maybe a no-show consulting gig. Alexander VI made his teenage son Cesare a cardinal at 18 years old, the youngest cardinal in church history. Let that sink in for a moment. A teenager who'd probably never read the Bible cover to cover was now one of the most powerful religious figures in Europe. But hey, Cesare knew 17 different ways to kill a man with a dinner knife, so he had that going for him. The Pope didn't even try to hide his corruption. He openly acknowledged his illegitimate children, plural, and treated Vatican appointments like a medieval LinkedIn network. Need a job? Know a Borgia. Want to keep your head attached to your shoulders? Also know a Borgia. But here's where our story takes a turn from garden variety corruption into full-blown family horror movie territory. Alexander VI had big plans for his son Juan, made him Captain General of the papal forces, essentially turning him into the Pope's personal warlord. The family's entire future was riding on Juan's military and political success. There was just one problem. Cesare wanted that job. Badly. See, Daddy had forced Cesare into the church against his will. The kid wanted to be a soldier, a conqueror, a Renaissance action hero. Instead, he was stuck wearing robes and pretending to care about theology, while his brother got all the fun toys. June 14th, 1497. Both brothers attend dinner at their mother's house. You know, just a nice family meal. Juan leaves afterward with some mysterious masked companion, riding off into the Roman night. he's never seen alive again. 9 days later, Juan's body surfaces in the Tiber River like a gruesome party favor nobody ordered. Throat slashed, stabbed multiple times, hands bound, meaning he was captured alive and, well, let's just say his final moments weren't pleasant. But here's the kicker. His purse was still full of money. This wasn't a robbery, this was personal. Contemporary observers immediately started pointing fingers at Cesare. And honestly, the timing was a bit too convenient. Juan dies, Cesare immediately gets his military position. It's like the medieval version of a hostile corporate takeover, except with more stabbing. The Pope wept for days, declared he'd rather lose all his papal power than his beloved son. Very touching, very dramatic. But did he launch a serious investigation into who murdered his child? Not so much. Call it parental blindness, call it willful ignorance, or call it what it probably was. The Pope suspected his own son was a fratricide, but couldn't bring himself to face the truth. When your family motto is essentially, blood is thicker than water, but money is thicker than both, fratricide starts looking less like a crime and more like career advancement. But wait, it gets worse. While the Pope was busy grieving one son and promoting the other, the Borgia family business was expanding in ways that would make a modern crime syndicate jealous. Alexander Sickings didn't just sell church positions, he revolutionized the entire practice, created new offices specifically to auction them off, held bidding wars for bishoprics in the papal apartments, turned indulgences, that's paying money to reduce your time in purgatory, into what was essentially medieval cryptocurrency. The numbers are absolutely staggering. Annual income from simony, that's the fancy term for selling church offices, reached over 100,000 ducats per year. That's roughly $120 million in today's money. Every single year, the total Borgia family wealth? Around 240 million in modern currency. And that's just what we know about. Not bad for a decade of religious service, right? But here's what really gets me about the whole operation. They weren't just stealing from the church. They were stealing from Christians across Europe who genuinely believed their donations were going towards spiritual purposes. Meanwhile, families in Rome were literally selling their daughters into prostitution to pay church taxes, while the Pope was hosting dinner parties that cost more than most villages' annual income. Speaking of which, let's talk about Cesare. Because while Daddy was busy turning the Vatican into a medieval Goldman Sachs, his son was perfecting the art of being history's most charming psychopath. Niccolo Machiavelli, yeah, that Machiavelli, met Cesare and was so impressed by his ruthless efficiency that he made him the model for the prince. When you become the template for political ruthlessness, you've definitely made an impression. But Machiavelli only saw Cesare's political side. He didn't see the murder sprees. Cesare's 1499 military campaigns weren't just conquests, they were extermination events. He executed prisoners by throwing them from castle walls because apparently crucifixion was too mainstream. Used captured enemies for crossbow target practice because why waste good ammunition on hay bales when you have perfectly good human targets? And then there were the disappearances. Entire noble families would simply vanish, poof, gone, like they never existed. Conservative estimate. Cesare was personally responsible for at least 50 documented murders, but that's just what we can prove. The real number was probably in the hundreds, and then there's the poison. The Borgias allegedly perfected a secret formula called cantarella, possibly arsenic-based, definitely effective. The exact recipe has been lost to history, but the results were well documented. Cardinals who opposed Borgia policies developed an alarming tendency to die suddenly after Vatican dinner parties. Mysterious stomach ailments, convenient heart failures. You know, natural causes. If your definition of natural includes trace amounts of heavy metals, was it really poison every time? Maybe not. But the statistical correlation between crossing the Borgias and sudden death was too convenient to ignore. It's like playing Russian roulette, except all the chambers are loaded and the gun is shaped like a wine goblet. Now you might be wondering, didn't anyone try to stop them? Weren't there laws? Wasn't someone paying attention? Well, funny story about that. The Borgias had turned corruption into such an art form that they'd essentially captured the entire system. Need a favor from the Vatican? Better bring cash. Want your legal troubles to disappear? Hope you've got something the Pope wants. Planning to oppose Borgia policies? Maybe update your will first. They weren't just breaking the law, they were the law. When you control the courts, the military, and supposedly have God on speed dial, who's going to stop you? But here's where the story gets really dark, because we haven't even talked about the orgies yet. October 30th, 1501. The infamous Banquet of Chestnuts. What happened that night in the Vatican apartments was so shocking that even papal apologists had trouble explaining it away. According to multiple contemporary accounts, Alexander VI hosted what was essentially an orgy in the papal residence. 50 prostitutes, various Vatican officials, activities that would make a modern adult film director blush. The details are too graphic for most history books, but the event became symbolic of just how far the papal court had fallen from any pretense of spiritual authority. When your religious leader is hosting orgies in the same building where Mass is celebrated, you've officially crossed the line from morally questionable to completely unhinged. And the best part, this wasn't some secret scandal that leaked out decades later. People knew, Romans were talking about it. Diplomats were writing home about the Pope's recreational activities. But did it matter? Did anyone do anything about it? Nope. Because who's going to excommunicate the Pope? It's the ultimate conflict of interest. This is the point where you'd expect divine intervention, right? Some kind of cosmic justice to rain down on the most corrupt papal dynasty in history. Well, funny thing about divine justice, sometimes it shows up fashionably late, but when it arrives, it brings friends. August 18th, 1503. Pope Alexander VI dies suddenly after 11 years of turning the Vatican into his personal criminal enterprise. The official cause? Fever. The unofficial cause? Well, that's where it gets interesting. See, people immediately suspected poison. Specifically that the Pope had been killed by his own family's favorite weapon. The irony was just too perfect to ignore. Some said it was Cesare, eliminating loose ends before making his next power move. Others suspected rival families finally getting their revenge. A few even suggested divine justice had finally shown up to the party. Whatever the cause, Alexander VI's death ended the Borgia papal dynasty instantly, like a house of cards in a hurricane. And Cesare. Without papal protection, his empire collapsed overnight. The new Pope, Julius II, took one look at the mess the Borgias had left behind and essentially hit the reset button, reversed every Borgia policy, seized family assets, declared open season on anyone with the surname Borgia. Cesare fled to Spain, where in 1507 he met an end that was almost too poetic to be real. He was thrown from his horse during a minor skirmish and stabbed to death by enemies who didn't even know who he was. The master manipulator, who'd spent years terrorizing Italy, died anonymously at the hands of peasants who just saw another armored thug threatening their village. His body was stripped, mutilated, and left in a ditch. No papal funeral, no monuments, no legacy except the terror he'd spread across Italy. The guy who'd murdered his way to power, who'd been feared from Rome to Naples, who'd inspired Machiavelli's treatise on ruthless leadership, died like a common bandit and was forgotten within a generation. Sometimes karma doesn't just catch up. It brings a whole crew and makes sure the job gets done right. But here's the thing about the Borgias that really gets me. Their corruption was so spectacular, so over-the-top outrageous, that it ended up backfiring in the most epic way possible. You see, their crimes weren't just personal. They weren't just stealing money or murdering rivals. They were undermining the entire credibility of the Catholic Church, at a time when Christianity was supposed to be the unifying force of European civilization. Martin Luther's famous 95 Theses, posted in 1517. Those weren't just theological complaints. They were essentially an indictment of exactly the kind of institutional corruption the Borgias had perfected. Oh, you're selling salvation to fund your family's murder spree. You're hosting orgies while claiming to be God's representative on earth. You're turning the church into a criminal enterprise? Well, then maybe we don't need your church anymore. The Protestant Reformation, which permanently split Christianity and reshaped European politics for centuries, was essentially Europe's response to Borgia-level institutional corruption. By turning the Vatican into their personal playground, The Borgias had inadvertently shattered the religious unity of an entire continent. Not bad for a family that just wanted to get rich and murder their enemies in peace. So what's the final tally on the Borgia legacy? Their wealth, an estimated 240 million in modern currency, vanished almost immediately after Alexander II's death. Their territorial conquests were reversed within months. Their political alliances crumbled faster than a house built on quicksand. But their real legacy wasn't money or power. It was proving that corruption has consequences, even when you think you're too big to fail. They spent 11 years demonstrating that crime absolutely does pay, until suddenly it doesn't. They accumulated unimaginable wealth and influence, then watched it all disappear faster than dinner guests at a Borgia banquet. In the end, the family that bought the papacy murdered their way to power and turned the Vatican into their personal criminal enterprise, left behind exactly one lasting contribution to history. They made the case for religious reforms so compelling that half of Europe decided to start their own churches. The Borgias wanted to be remembered as a great papal dynasty, the Spanish nobles who conquered Rome and bent Europe to their will. Instead, they became history's perfect example of what happens when power meets absolute shamelessness, a cautionary tale about the difference between getting away with something and actually getting away with it. They proved that you can corrupt any institution, buy any position, and murder any rival, but you can't escape the consequences forever. Eventually the bill comes due, and when it does, compound interest is a real killer. So the next time someone tells you crime doesn't pay, remind them about the Borgias. Crime paid beautifully, right up until it didn't. And when the reckoning finally came, it brought friends, carried interest, and had a very long memory. Turns out divine justice might work in mysterious ways, but it's got excellent timing and a wicked sense of humor.